Hôtel des Invalides in the heart of Paris. Today it houses the collections of the Army Museum.
When the visitors enter the Hôtel des Invalides, the first thing they see is this monumental statue of Napoleon in a frock coat with the legendary hat, the silhouette of a legend who watches over the museum day and night, a bit like the statue of the commander.
Paradox, this legendary work is signed by a completely unknown sculptor, Charles Emile Seurre. The destiny of the statue is intimately linked to the political troubles of the 19th century. It even almost disappeared.
As soon as the statue is placed on the bridge, it falls into the water, and then we have the right to ask ourselves the question to know if it's an international act. Some say that in 1870, when the statue sank, the head separated from the body.
What happened between its manufacture in 1833 and the day it found its place at the Invalides in 1911, 80 years later? It all begins at Place Vendôme. In 1810, Napoleon I, at the height of his glory, he decided to build this monument. It is called the Column of the Grande Armée. Of course, he surmounted it with a statue of himself dressed as a Roman emperor. Why this representation in the antique style? Answer with Nicolas Bonnel, passionate about the history of Paris.
Napoleon decided to represent himself as a Roman emperor for several reasons. The first reason is that he considered that there was a direct analogy between his empire and the empire of the Caesars at the time of ancient Rome, which he had conquered a large part of Europe. The second reason was that he thought it was a nice way to reward the glory he considered to have acquired after all the battles he'd won in Eastern Europe.
This statue did not remain at the top of the column for long. In 1814, during the Restoration, King Louis XVIII replaced it with the symbol of the monarchy, the white flag with the fleur-de-lis. But 15 years later, the new monarch, Louis-Philippe, wanted to make a political move.
Louis-Philippe was eager to win the favor of the Bonapartes. As a result, he felt somewhat obliged, in a political climate that was a little tense, to make a symbolic gesture, and there was other gestures in the wake that followed. He removed and accepted as king of the French the flag of the monarchy that was enthroned above the Vendôme column, to replace it with a new statue of Napoleon, but this time not dressed as Caesar, but dressed as a corporal of the guard.
Why this distinction? Here we are at the Hôtel des Invalides.
This statue is really the silhouette of the legend. It is the Napoleon that we all know, that the legend has popularized. Napoleon in a frock coat with the characteristic hat, with the characteristic attitude of the hand in the jacket, with also, when we observe more closely, other elements linked to his history. We notice the decorations of the Legion of Honor, which he created. We notice at his feet a ball and chain that reminds us that he was an artilleryman. The hand in the vest is a characteristic attitude of Napoleon. We know it from the memorialists. We do not know the precise cause. There were several hypotheses. In particular, it was said that he had a stomachache. It was also to give himself contentment. What is certain is that this is in keeping with what Napoleon was like when he was alive.
This attention to detail is precisely what fascinates at the time.
And what pleases both the power and the opinion is that one has the impression of finding the real Napoleon, the living Napoleon, because of this frock coat, this hat, these familiar attitudes. I would add that for the power of Louis-Philippe, it is better to have the silhouette of the legend of Napoleon rather than the emperor, who would be a dynastic rival.
The sculptor, Charles Emile Seurre, thus restored an authentic uniform of the emperor, a uniform that was designed by Napoleon himself. In the rooms of the museum, it can be found in numerous representations, such as on this painting of the abdication.
We do have an iconography that is one that Napoleon during his lifetime sought to spread by adopting an outfit that, in a way, was a modest outfit, since it was not, or it did not appear to be, the outfit of the head of the armies. But in a way, it placed the emperor outside of any military hierarchy by its modesty. It affirmed that his power was of another nature, and that it was the power of an emperor, a power both military and civil. And this image, he truly wanted it.
It is this modest uniform that earned Napoleon his affectionate nickname of Petit Caporal. We discover the details in the room devoted to Napoleon on campaign. All these objects were part of the emperor's daily life.
Among the objects found in the statue of Seurre, obviously the officer's coat made of grey cloth or frock coat. On the other hand, the bicorn that he wore, and the mannequin shows it well, in battle, as we used to say, in a way perpendicular to the wearer's march, and not in the axis of the march. That is to say, for the emperor, differently from what was the habit of his generals and marshals who carried him in the axis of the march.
Another mythical accessory of Napoleon on campaign, his telescopic telescope. A detail that the sculptor did not forget. So who is this Charles Emile Seurre? Here is the only surviving representation of the man, this curious portrait. To find traces of this little-known artist, you must first go to the most famous Parisian cemetery, Père Lachaise.
You want to take a little tour of the sculpture before going to the Louvre. It came to Père Lachaise. Well, it's a little more difficult because you have to look for it. There are no labels, there's nothing, so you really have to look.
Among the funerary monuments, a work signed by Pierre Cartellier, a very famous 19th century sculptor, also buried in Père Lachaise. It is in his workshop that Charles Emile Seurre begins. To find a trace of the pupil, it is necessary to go on the tomb of the master.
Seurre signed a very small part that we see just behind. It's the part called Le Talent, in the center of this composition.
Talent, modesty, and glory. The students have drawn allegories of the master's virtues.
The virtues that we have here are virtues represented in an ancient way. We remain in a certain classism, so there's not really any innovation, and we can see that the master's touch is still here. If it wasn't indicated on the sculptures who the sculpture was, you might think that it was all the same work.
One might say that Seurre's work goes unnoticed at Père Lachaise.
Charles Emile Seurre, I must tell you that many people pass by without really knowing who this man was.
So how could a sculptor without any particular genius or great renown receive such an important commission as Napoleon? To find out, direction the Palace of Versailles. We are in the Museum of French History, wanted by Louis Philippe, the sponsor of the statue of Napoleon. Galleries dedicated to the great men of French history.
The history galleries, whose creation was decided by Louis Philippe as early as 1832, mobilized a rather impressive amount of talent. In fact, they took all the talents that were on the market at the time and gave them commissions. And in sculpture alone, nearly 2,000 works were gathered and produced for this purpose. Sculptors who would never normally have received such commissions found themselves propelled by this game of supply and demand. And Seurre, of course, was one of those sculptors who, without the Museum of French History, without Louis Philippe's museum, would not have the career that he obviously had.
Seurre followed the royal road. Beaux-Arts, Grand Prix de Rome, and above all, a student of Pierre Cartellier.
Many of Cartellier's student sculptures worked for Versailles, Cartellier having died quite early, not having had the good fortune to experience the heyday of Versailles' commissions. But his pupils, the next generation if you like, had a rather royal access to the construction site of the historical galleries of Versailles.
It was at the same time that Louis Philippe commissioned his statue of Napoleon. He even asked for a reduced replica for the Palace of Versailles. It is shortly after the death of Cartellier, an opportunity for Charles Emile Seurre, his student.
It is possible that it was a pupil of Cartellier, and we must remember that he was returning from his stay at the French Academy in Rome at the time, or that it was in these two capacities that he obtained the commission for the large statue for the top of the Vendôme column.
And as in the Gallery of Great Men, the style is ultra-academic.
He adopts this party of a Napoleon dressed in the costume of the time. It's also one of the characteristics of the art of Seurre and his generation. It's this historicist interest in representation. The Napoleon that Seurre represents and that Louis-Philippe commissioned from him, both for the Vendôme column and for the Versailles Museum, is a Napoleon anchored in French history. A Napoleon who represents a moment in French history and not this Napoleon, dressed in antique style with this idea of a timeless power through his imperial reference.
The monumental statue of Napoleon, 4 meters high, was made by a great founder of the time, Cosetier. Ironically, the bronze was cast from Austrian cannons. No less than 16 were needed. We are at the oldest foundry in Paris, the Seuss foundry in Arcueil. Art Foundry experienced a golden age in the 19th century, at the very moment when sculptures were multiplying on the Parisian plazas.
The foundry for two reasons. First, the technique that allowed the sculpture to be disseminated. Otherwise, the sculpture was a single copy. It was also a way to honor perhaps great characters. The monumental, it was inevitably the bronze, so the monumental sculptures that adorned the cities were always in bronze.
Today, the technique most often used is that of lost wax, as here, where the bronze will replace the wax in the mold. But it is probably another process that the founder Cosetier used at the time.
I would be surprised if it wasn't a sand casting. It was the leading technique in France at the time. The technique of sand casting basically consists of rising the impression with sand, hardening the sand around the model given by the artist, and in these different sand mold elements, pouring the molten metal.
But the real difficulty lies in the size of the sculpture.
Monumental bronzes were produced in several pieces that were then reassembled once each element had been cast in bronze. Because casting several tons in a single stream requires a huge melting furnace and a huge amount of energy. And this was not within the reach of all art founders. At the time, it was hours and hours of hammering to close up, to make the joints of the assemblies. So, it was a lot of work, but time didn't matter.
The secret of a beautiful bronze is its patina, because green is not only the result of natural oxidation.
The patina, which we call vert de gris, it's really the classic patina for monuments. The sculptures that go outside are artificial, but you have to imagine that outside, nature will take over and that the real vert de gris will really appear in the form of drips.
The processes have hardly changed since Cosetier's time.
In the 19th century, it was the same techniques. There are not many products that can make this color. Moreover, for 19th century bronze, we generally try, before doing retouches, when there are restorations, to look at what patina was used. And so the products have not changed. It's the nitrates, it's the dichromats.
The statue of Napoleon ordered by Louis-Philippe left the Cosetier foundry on July 20th, 1833. It leaves the Barrière du Roule between Parc Monceau and Étoile to reach the Place Vendôme in the greatest discretion.
The statue leaves the foundry at 3:15 a.m. At 3:15 a.m., a silent convoy in the middle of the night heads for the Place Vendôme via the Place de l'Étoile, the Champs-Élysées and other places. At 5 a.m., it arrives on the spot in the greatest discretion. The statue is assembled without event, without drum or trumpet, and we arrive at 12:30 to the statue of Seurre, and it's finally mounted on top of the column and bolted with 2 copper plugs, I think, if my memory serves me correct.
The base of the statue has kept the trace of these 2 bolts, which fixed it that day to the column.
We can imagine that there was a deliberate discretion in the relation to this setup at the beginning, because I think it was more a political act on the part of Louis Philippe than a real desire to promote Napoleon I.
Louis Philippe wanted at all costs to avoid a nostalgic procession for the emperor. According to the Figaro, dated July 21, 1833, the risk is real.
It was so serious that this installation of the statue, there was to fear a so violent riot, a sympathy so lively, so turbulent for this image of a dead man, that the Parisian was in the case to seize it, to crown it, to proclaim it emperor and king. On the 21st, the press began talking about it, and inauguration was planned for the 28th. And July 28, 1833 is a very important date because, symbolically, it was the 3rd anniversary of the 3 glorious days, the 3 days of 1830, which saw the fall of Charles X and the advent of Louis Philippe. So, 28, 29 and 30, 1830. So on that day, the statue was inaugurated in the presence of Louis Philippe and in the presence of Napoleon's former grognags who were there, gathered for the occasion. And Louis Philippe quite cleverly, politically, upon seeing the emotion of the former grognags at the moment of the veil of the statue was removed, walked up to the statue, took a knee and shouted, "Long live the Emperor."
Louis Philippe did not stop there. At the Hôtel des Invalides, he ordered a monumental mausoleum to house the ashes of the emperor, which he had repatriated from St. Helena, a hand extended to the Bonapartists.
The July monarchy tried to settle down in the broadest possible tradition by taking up the heritage of the revolution, by taking up the heritage of the empire, and in a certain way, what we would call today, the recovery of the image of Napoleon. I was part of this search for a lost national cohesion. And in this spirit, he proceeded to the return of the remains, the return of the ashes, as they say, of the Emperor Napoleon. And it is the means for him, in some sorts, to attract the sympathy of the public opinion, Bonapartist or reputed such.
And to recall his role in the episode, Louis Philippe imagines this bas-relief, where he appears in the foreground, a form of political propaganda before its time. With this tomb, the Hôtel des Invalides was definitely consecrated as a military pantheon. But on the Place Vendôme side, the statue wanted by Louis Philippe did not withstand the political changes. In 1850, Louis Philippe abdicates. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, the nephew of Napoleon I, is elected. He became Emperor Napoleon III and removed the statue of Charles Emile Seurre from the column, replacing it with a new Napoleon in the antique style. This was to restore the prestige of the family dynasty. But what happens to the Seurre statue?
The statue of Seurre, so the second statue, was unbolted from its original location and was placed at the location of the former traffic circle of Courbevoie, at the level of the current defense district.
You have to go there to understand why Napoleon III chose to place the statue of Seurre in Courbevoie.
There are several explanations for this. The first is that it's hard to imagine Napoleon III literally sacrificing a statue of his grandfather. The second thing is that the Courbevoie roundabout was a very interesting place because it was high up and it allowed, in the axis of the setting sun, to see Napoleon's silhouette against the setting sun. This gave a somewhat dreamlike symbolism to the image of Napoleon I. And finally, the last reason is that this roundabout in Courbevoie was located right in the axis of the Royal Road, which was extended by the Arc de Triomphe, with a strong symbolism.
But Napoleon was not to remain on this pedestal for long. In 1870, the Prussians are at the gates of Paris. The city was under siege. In Courbevoie, the statue is threatened.
Rumours were flying at the time, and one of the rumours was that the statue of Seurre would be taken down, tied by the neck and dragged by a cart along the streets of the capital. The Parisians were a little worried and thought that something had to be done. So they rushed to the statue, unbolted it, and told themselves that they would protect it by putting it in the Invalides.
The statue of Napoleon will be replaced by this one, which commemorates the national defense against the Prussians. And it is this sculpture that gave its name to the business district of La Défense. As for the Napoleon of Seurre, it was sent to the Invalides by the Seine, but it never arrived at its destination.
No sooner had the statue been placed on the barge that it fell into the water. Some said it was intentional, others said no, it was a simple accident, but the barge couldn't support the weight of the statue. It was 4 tons. Given the climate that reigned at the time in relation to the empire, given the climate of the passion that reigned at the time, it could very well have been an intentional act on the part of someone who simply did not wish to protect the emblematic figure of Napoleon.
Accident. Intentional act? There is a third theory published in the newspaper La Presse.
A floor hastily built on the bank allowed the truck to engage in front and overhang the river, so that one needed to drown this heavy mass of bronze only to undo the ropes. This operation, which took place at night, was intended to protect this work of art from the vandalism of the crowd.
In the end, the causes of Napoleon's drowning will never be clarified. At the end of October 1870, the French army surrendered to the Prussians in Sedan. But some Parisians rise up. It's the Paris Commune. They ransacked the symbols of the monarchy and the empire. On May 16, 1871, the Vendôme column was shot down by the Communards. The statue of Napoleon lay in the middle of the rubble. It will be several years before it is restored and placed as we see it today. But as for the Napoleon as a little corporal, he was not found until 40 years later in the reserves. So when was he fished out? Where was he found? No newspaper mentions it, but there is a controversy about Napoleon's head.
It was decided to restore it in the 1910s, but what's very strange is that the head of the statue today is not the original head.
One might think that the head was too damaged, and yet...
I saw this statue at the marble depot. The head was separated from the rest of the body. The hat was shredded in front and behind with parts missing. The nose was damaged. The chest was broken at the collar. I certify that I could perfectly restore this statue without having to cast another head. There is a theory which came out about that time that the founder in charge of the restoration sold the old head, the original head, to the Americans for about 50,000 francs at the time. So today, one thing that remains certain, the head of the Seurre statue today at the Invalides is not the original head.
At the Invalides, François Lagrange is less categorical.
Some say that in 1870, when the statue sank, the head separated from the body. We don't know if this is true, but there are all sorts of rumors saying that the original head was recast, glued back onto the body. Others say that a new head had been recast and placed on the body. In short, there was a whole debate in 1911 to 1912 about whether it was the right head on the right body.
So, original head or redone? The mystery remains. Why did they finally decide to put Seurre's statue in the Invalides, 40 years after leaving Courbevoie?
There are plaster models that were used to make this bronze statue of Seurre, which is placed in the very place you know today. We know that people want to take pieces of it away, so as it is made of plaster, it deteriorates, and finally, in the years 1909, it was noticed that it was very damaged. It was then that Jules Vanquier, one of the members of the Friends of the Museum de l'Armée, decided to propose replacing this damaged plaster with the bronze statue of Seurre that he knew was in reserve.
And on March 11, 1911, the 4 tons of bronze of the statue are hoisted. It finally found its place in its alcove. The act is recorded in the Bulletin of the Museum of the Army.
It is thanks to the initiative taken by the Society of the Friends of the Museum of the Army that Mr. Under-Secretary of State for Fine Arts decided to have the bronze statue of Napoleon erected in the courtyard of honour of the Invalides, which formerly surmounted the column of the Grande Armée on Place Vendôme. This statue replaced the plaster model, which was exposed to rapid deterioration. It was last as long as the building itself.